Our old friend Matt Williams is at it again about the bomb squad. But might he actually have a point this time? In this episode, you are going to get a front row seat to what he said, my analysis of it, as well as actual scientific studies that will hopefully settle the argument for once and for all. So we know in the past Matt Williams has had a few unsavoury things to say, specifically about the Springboks and our bomb squad tactic. The Australian accused our strategy of being unethical. Now in this year's Six Nations, we actually saw several teams go 6-2 on several occasions. Remember, 6-2 is the original bomb squad split between forwards and backs. Then France twice did what we did 3 times in 2023. They went with a 7-1 split. Now, in the third week of this year's competition, Ireland were the only team that went with the more traditional 5-3 split. So here's what Williams had to say about that. He's talking here on Virgin Media.
It's not the coach's fault. It's just become this thing that is incredibly discriminating against backline players. We want people of all physiques to play our game, because this is not just an international level. This is going down to other levels of the game. And the numbers are quite extraordinary. You think back in the old 5 nations, it was 40 forwards and 35 backs. It was that, and we've got an 8-7 split. That's exactly the way our game is. Now, if we look, we've got a graph coming up here that shows the numbers, and it's quite extraordinary. This is this weekend. So in the starting 15s, there's going to be 48 forwards and 35 backs. But look at the bench. 36 forwards on the bench and only 12. So this weekend, there is 84 forwards playing and only 47 backs. That's almost, as close to 100% as you could get. Now that is not what our game's about.
I should also point out, guys, that it took me a while to put this episode together because obviously what Williams says here is from a few weeks ago. So I needed to get a few other elements to make this episode as great as possible. And then I also went down with the flu a couple of weeks ago. So that's what's prevented me from doing this for you sooner. I do believe, though, that everything you're hearing and seeing remains wholly relevant until World Rugby changes the law. Now, what Williams is saying here, to me, is a load of hogwash. Apart from rugby being a sport for all shapes and sizes, which is 100% accurate, everything else he says, well, it's just subjective. It's his opinion. Would it be nice to have more backline players involved on game day? Yeah, maybe. But Williams, who don't forget once coached Scotland, would know better than most that rugby is a sport where it all starts up front. Games are won and lost up front. Show me a weak pack, and I'll show you a team that loses more than it wins. You don't have to have the best pack to win, but if you have a weak pack, you're not going to win, are you? Let's hear what else Williams had to say in this rant.
It is not the coach's fault. I understand the tactics, and I agree with the tactics.
He agrees with the tactics? That just feels like him saying something for the sake of saying something. We all know he doesn't agree with it. He's made that abundantly clear in the past. But for the sake of us not nitpicking one thing he says and having a go, let's hear the rest of the point he was trying to make.
But World Rugby has to act on this. It's dangerous in so many ways. It's dangerous about concussions, bringing big fit guys on the field. It's dangerous to our scrums at the lower levels of our game, and it is not bringing in the ethos of our game. It's going against what we want. We're going for brutality of scrummaging against the finesse. We're out of balance. The point is, it's a game our game is always in the conflict of balance.
Yeah.
And with that, you can see with those numbers, that is completely out of balance.
That was brought in a few years ago.
Okay, now what he is saying here is actually a common retort to those of us who defend the bomb squad tactic. He claims it is dangerous and it increases concussions. The point about the game being out of balance to me is also highly subjective. It's only out of balance if you want to see the number of forwards and backs in a team or matchday squad as close as possible to 50-50. But why would that even happen? Remember when it was 6 substitutes in the old days and coaches went 3 forwards and 3 backs? But those players could only really go on for injuries, so it made sense. Then the sport turned professional and the replacements bench was increased to 7. What did every coach on earth do? The additional replacement player was a forward. Why did no one put a fourth back on the bench instead? Do you think Williams would have put a fourth back on the bench when he was coaching Scotland? I don't. Maybe because the game is one up front. Similarly, when the bench was increased to 8 players, did any coach go with a 4-4 split? No. Every coach added an additional forward and went with a 5-3 split. So at no point has balance been a factor. But I want to come back to the danger element. It has been completely and utterly refuted. Our very own Professor Ross Tucker was part of a team that looked into the matter for World Rugby. What did they find? It might be the most obvious thing on earth, but as it turns out, more fatigue leads to more injury. So in other words, the more tired players you have on the field, the more likely you are going to see injuries. Put another way, the more time a player spends on the field, the more likely he is to suffer one of those concussions that Williams claims to be so concerned about. Some have even suggested going back to 7 or even 6 substitutes, or doing away with tactical substitutions. I want to show you something that Professor Tucker posted on X. If there is to be a reduction in subs number, it would be despite evidence, not because of it, or for other reasons. Evidence suggests that as replacements are added to a tackle event, injury risk drops, and that fatigued versus fatigued injury risk is higher than fresh versus fatigued. Now yes, I agree with that, but that's not me saying it. That's Professor Ross Tucker, sports scientist. If that is not the view that should prevail, then I really don't know what else to say. Ironically, World Rugby's former chairman, Bill Beaumont, went against this very scientific evidence. Look at this old quote of his. My view is that we allow too many substitutes. I don't know if I'm looking through rose-coloured spectacles, but in years gone by, the game always opened up in the last 20 minutes, and games were often won in the last 20 minutes. Now that seems to be the overriding argument that fatigued players in the last 20 minutes resulted in more mistakes, meaning the game opened up, making for allegedly exciting gameplay. But it is also worth reminding that a lot of that nostalgia is for an era where the sport was amateur. The players are now professionals, in case Matt Williams and his fellow supporters have not noticed. They are in the gym every day, for example. You cannot compare accountants, doctors and lawyers playing rugby after work for the love of the sport to what effectively amounts to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Spoiler alert, Arnie wins every time. Now, I want to add that despite my and I believe our collective disagreements with Matt Williams, the man is not actually completely delusional. Take a look at what he went on to say, because I do think that there's actually merit in this.
I've seen this at lower levels of the game. If they've got a 7-1 bench at a lower level of the game and the other team doesn't have a strong forward pack, and you've got a tight head prop who's very fatigued late in the game, and you bring on 7 fresh forwards, you know, we're dealing with spinal injuries again, and we don't want to get to that point. My generation dealt with that. I had a club mate who became a quadriplegic. I was there that day. It's seared into my heart. I don't want to see that back in the game. And this is a multi-levels while we're doing this. And we can't just think about test match rugby. We've got to think about the AIL. We've got to think about the lower levels of the game where people copy what they see from the big stage. You know, I go back to Sydney. I see it in my club doing it. I see schools now bringing on fresh reserves. Like, we don't want to get to that point. And World Rugby needs to act for the good of the global game, not the good of an international team.
Now, just in terms of his teammate that suffered that injury and became quadriplegic, I can only say how horrible that must have been for Matt. And of course, none of us want to see that. I readily think of Max Brito at the 1995 Rugby World Cup playing for Côte d'Ivoire against Tonga. The tackler obviously didn't intend to put Brito in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And it was beautiful to see how the global rugby community rallied around Brito after that, raising funds and trying to ensure that he could be as comfortable as possible. Having said that, in any sport, especially a physical one like rugby, there is an inherent risk. I'm not trying to be insensitive here, guys, or trying to downplay it, but it's like boxing in a way. When you get into the ring, you know there's a chance that something could go wrong and the consequences could be dire. The laws are in place to try to ensure as safe an environment as possible, of course. But whether it's boxing or rugby or MMA or whatever the case may be, anything else for that matter, accidents occur. Bad technique on the part of a defender could cause chaos. There are risks involved. And I think it's fair to say that most rugby players accept that there is a risk going in. But in terms of what Williams is talking about at the lower levels of the game, then I think he does indeed have a point. I grew up in Cape Town, and let's say it's Villagers against NTK. Do those two clubs have players of sufficient capability in terms of replacements? At that level, or even in the lower divisions, and let's think schoolboy rugby, not Bishops and Paul Roos, let's say Spine Road High School against Eben Donges. If you know where those two schools are, let me know in the comment section, by the way. Chances are high those schools, while potentially copying a 6-2 or 7-1, don't have like for like. And when I say like for like, I mean Frans Malherbe goes off and Vincent Koch or Trevor Nyakane comes on. But perhaps more importantly, since we're emphasizing safety, if the one school has a Malherbe type starting, then the other school also has to have a Malherbe type starting. Otherwise, you have a physical mismatch. Just like the physical mismatch Williams is moaning about when a bomb squad player comes on. Remember, he's complaining about a fatigued tight head having to come up against a fresh tight head. Is that not a safety concern? Not having like for like at the lower levels? The Williams argument is based on the assumption that both sets of forwards are equally matched physically from the start of the match. And then you have a mismatch when one team brings on fresh forwards. But the fact of the matter, in many matches, at many levels, you have physical mismatches from the very start. More on that in a moment. I do think that at that lower level, there are certain measures that can easily be put in place to increase safety. Simple example is that different age groups play rugby matches for different durations. Under 12s don't play 40 minutes per half, for example. But where Williams is not going to win this one is that his argument assumes that every pack of forwards starts every match on a more or less equal footing. And that has never been the case. Whether it's the Springboks against Namibia, or Villagers against Durbanville-Bellville, or Sachs against Brackenfell, unless you want parity between the starting forwards or front row, the argument is flawed. Chances are pretty good that the front row at Paarl Gym are going to be overwhelmingly superior to the front row that Tableview High has, whether it's the starting front row or the quote-unquote bomb squad front row that comes on later. The Gimmies players could legitimately hurt the Tableview boys from the very first whistle of that match. So what difference does it make if there's another front row or 6 or 7 extra forwards that are coming on in the second half? Fatigue, yes, but remember what Professor Tucker's study showed us. A fatigued player against a fresh player has a lower risk of injuries occurring than a fatigued player against another fatigued player. So by bringing on a fresh player, you are reducing the risk of injury. Just coming back to my example, Gimmies against Tableview, right? The Gimmies players are probably bigger and better before the referee blows his first whistle. So if safety is the primary concern, then you surely would find that kind of mismatch to be what is the real thing. that is problematic. The physical mismatch. And then, where do you draw the line? The only logical conclusion is to end rugby, or to turn it into rugby league, where all the players are basically the same size. And that would render the scrum nothing but a set piece that restarts play. I think if you're a rugby fan, there's no way you want to see that. I love the scrum. I love the ability of a pack to dominate, win penalties, and exert pressure on the opposition. It's a defensive weapon too. So I'm sorry, but the scientific evidence is against Matt Williams, certainly at the elite professional level, and quite frankly, I'm not convinced there's a logical explanation or solution to the problem that he is presenting even at the lower levels. Unless we decide that Paul Gymnasium is never allowed to play against Tableview High School because their players are physically bigger and better, and it creates a physical mismatch, and that is a safety concern. The only other thing that I can think of is at age group levels, players play by weight category up until under 16 or under 19, but even that, I'm not so sure that that is the solution. Because again, this is supposed to be a sport for all shapes and sizes. And so your small scrum half at some point is going to have to try and tackle the big giant lock. So it seems to me to be more a case of moral outrage without a clear and obvious solution, when the reality is that the sport that we love so much is set up in this way. And yes, there is an inherent risk, and the players accept that risk when they take to the field. I suppose Matt Williams and those who think like him would also have complained about Jonah Lomu purely because no one had ever seen a wing that big before. Talk about a physical mismatch. Would they have urged World Rugby to outlaw Lomu? I mean, you think of the Rugby World Cup and that semi-final when Lomu ran over Mike Catt. Was that not a concussion waiting to happen? Let me stop there and ask you, what do you think? Maybe you agree with Matt Williams on this occasion. And if so, what is your solution? I'd love to know. Maybe you agree with what I've said, which is basically just parroting and clarifying what Professor Ross Tucker had to say. Let me know in the comment section down below, and while you're down there, why not give me a super thanks? That's the heart button with a $sign inside of it. You'll be able to make a highlighted comment and make a small donation to my channel. I promise to reply. I will also click the heart button on your comment. And the reason I'm looking for donations, guys, is because I would love to do this full time, and to that end, go to Australia and cover the Rugby World Cup for you from down under with daily content. The donations are whatever you want them to be, so it can be $1 or $100 million. You can opt for the latter if you're an Ackerman, Becker, or Gates. Hint, hint. If you're not yet ready to support me financially, you can also just spear tackle the like button, and you can also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And if you're enjoying my channel, may I recommend this video where I spoke exclusively to 2015 Springbok assistant coach Ricardo Loubser about how that year's Boks got so close yet so far. You'll be amazed at what he reveals about that Rugby World Cup, especially the semi-final defeat to New Zealand. You might also be interested in my most recent episode where I gave my honest thoughts on the brand new podcast hosted by Dr. Rassie Erasmus. That one is over here. Go check one of them out, and I will speak to you next time.